Welcome to another episode of Athens and Jerusalem. Let's begin where we can't escape. Let's begin with Logos.
Now, I would say that this openness, this being in the world, this referring to the world, to objects in the world, what I would like to call self-transcendence, this is disappearing as soon as you project a human being into a lower dimension than its own dimension.
The point of the V goes up to the nuclear explosion that created it.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point.
Do not be afraid. Open your hearts, open up your hearts.
Open up your hearts to Athens and Jerusalem. The infants of our culture, united, independent, polarized, and even bloody. Athens, the cradle of wisdom and rationality. Jerusalem, the cradle of faith and spirituality. In this podcast, we look at reunion. Could reason be more than modern secular skepticism? And could spirituality be more than belief? Welcome to another episode of the Athens and Jerusalem podcast. It is the three of us today as normal. Actually, today, I don't know if you both know, but the Pope died.
Yes, unfortunately.
You've heard
yes,
it?
I
I
did.
have not heard yet.
No, because in Portland it's just early morning, but we have the afternoon in Europe. So that's news, and I thought maybe because we have discussed if we should try to talk a little bit about Spinoza.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the combination is, but we could try to discuss Spinoza and
Okay.
further also because on our last podcast we discussed to pray, and we even discussed if this should be like a skill or a competence that normal children should try to practice in school. And then I thought maybe okay, but should we also discuss what do we understand as the basic skills to learn in school? Or maybe not to learn, but to practice, because I think it's problematic that we always talk about school as some place to learn something, but more a place where you could practice basic abilities as human being. So that could also be a topic maybe for the podcast.
Great.
So Stephen, I saw you had some ideas about Spinoza.
Well, we were, I think, reading, or we shared amongst ourselves an article in Prospect magazine on Spinoza's God, which we discussed as maybe a point of departure for a conversation, and so we could do that. I reread that article.
I think we could start there.
Yeah.
I must admit that I will be mostly learning here. My contributions will come if you ever get to that part about learning at school. Then I have maybe a metaphor to offer as a starting point for that. But okay, let's hear about Spinoza.
See if we can
I'm
tie it all
interested.
together and bring the Pope in too at some point.
That would be nice. Yes, but Stephen, what do you remember from the article you read? Or should I try to?
You could try to summarize first, and then I can jump in.
Because this interesting philosopher, Bach Spinoza, in the time he lived, they even thought of him as an atheist. And this could always be discussed, but he tried to think about in a rational way what God is. And one of his main understanding of God was that God is eternal. And then he was discussing with Descartes, that was before him, and Descartes had made a duality between spirit and materiality, or between the earth and spirituality. And Spinoza didn't understand this duality if God was eternal, because if God is eternal, he must be into everything that exists. It can't just be out there in heaven or out there in space, but in the world or on earth there are something else, because earth is part of what exists and what is eternal. So therefore he ended up understanding everything as something to do with spirituality, or with the spirit, or with God, the divine. So then he is in a way the first modern pantheist. But then I would also comment, because they say often that, okay, he was like the first pantheist, but the old Greek way of thinking was in many ways, especially in Platonic way of Timaios dialogue, for instance, is very also Platonic, pantheistic. So that was, yeah. But then, of course, there comes another discussion, and that is, what about evil? If evil exists, does that also mean that God is evil, or what it, because on the material world, on earth, so this ethical issue becomes a big discussion for Spinoza, and he ends, I think it's after his death that the book of ethics comes been published.
I remember as an undergraduate reading Spinoza for the first time, and kind of dismissing him at the time, buying into this, I think, unfair characterization of Spinoza as an atheist, a materialist, a pantheist, all of these things. And you can justify that by pulling sentences out of his ethics, to come to that conclusion. But I think it's an unfair conclusion. And the German poet Novalis famously called him that God intoxicated man, which has been much repeated by others. And I think in later life, as I've revisited Spinoza, I've come to really love him. And I think understand him at a different level than I did as an undergraduate. And if I could like identify that sort of the point where he represents this huge departure from the cultural context from which he came. He's in the early 1600s Europe. Everyone is a theist. Everyone sees the world as in these dualistic terms, as there being, spirit and matter, separate substances, God and the world, separate things. Descartes was this famous philosopher just coming a generation before Spinoza. So Spinoza is also engaging Descartes' dualism to some extent. And I think the point of departure is that Spinoza has this different sort of philosophical temperament and a different intuition about what the ultimate explanations for things can be. And he wasn't the first to have this intuition. As you point out, the ancient Greeks also had this intuition, which is ultimately, if one tries to sum it up in a sentence, it's that the ultimate cause is not something out there, but something in here. And from a scientific perspective, you could pick either one, and there's equal lack of evidence for either one. Ultimately, it's a kind of metaphysical choice one makes, and from either premise, you can get to the world that we actually live in and inhabit. But Spinoza's intuition about these things was that it was more of a kind of a unitary concept of the world. It makes more sense if everything is all interconnected and that all the causes are inhering in the substances of things. And so he took this radical step of saying, well, God is not something out there, but God it has something to do with the substances of everything. And so naturally and understandably, he gets labeled as an atheist. He gets cast out of the congregation. He gets, shunned by, socially, ostracized. Huge consequences for this, because in the eyes of those around him, what he was doing was demoting God from his rightful position as a transcendent, all-powerful, exalted, perfect being out there, outside of the world, and he's pulling God down into the world, which is this blasphemous act that deserving of the greatest opprobrium and punishment. But if one, I think, understands the premise, understands what he's doing, and that the premise was not a fundamentally irreligious premise. In his own way, he was, as Navala said, this God intoxicated man. His whole view of the world was infused with thinking about God and thinking about the consequences of this idea of God, this non-dualistic idea of God, for how we actually live in the world, which is why his main work, published posthumously, as he said, is called Ethics. Think, well, why is it called Ethics when most of what we think about when we think about Spinoza is metaphysics? It's pantheistic and it's materialistic and all these sorts of things. Spinoza understood that the major consequence and the thing he had to explain and justify on the basis of this different philosophical intuition about God was getting to an ethical position, which was which ultimately what was acceptable, something which was not so different from the ethical position arrived at through the theistic premises. And so what he does in his major philosophical work is show that starting from this completely different metaphysical premise, you can get to a similar sort of ethical stance as theists have.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge, I think that's just, it's a huge intellectual milestone for Western culture.
I agree, and of course one of the big issue that he turns into about human ethics is the question of determinism, and how this question, if we are also part of this God, what God has created, and okay,
where does free will come in?
Yeah. So that's also something that is very interesting to discuss, and I think that's also why, because a lot of people say that he is more or less just a mechanic understanding of human beings.
Yeah, and free will is one of these is one of the challenges in thinking about Spinoza, because his idea that everything is bound by these mutual ties of interconnectivity and reciprocity seems to leave no space for the kind of free will that we imagine naively, that free will means the ability to make decisions outside of the usual causal framework. That might be our naive intuition of what free will is. And Spinoza would deny that. He would say, no, we don't have free will in that sense. His idea of free will was more making a choice to come to terms with the necessity of the world we live in, and harmonizing oneself with its exigencies and requirements, which actually puts Spinoza very much in line with the Stoics of ancient times. So there are huge connections, I think, ethically between Spinoza and the Stoicism of the ancient Greeks and Romans, because they're both about a kind of understanding one's position in this interconnected web of life in which one has limited freedoms, and true freedom then becomes a kind of aligning oneself with those forces of necessity that one is immersed in. And one could say, well, how is that any different than the freedom of a leaf when it falls from the tree? So are we saying that our freedom is the same as the freedom of everything else? Aren't we just playing with words then? Are we just taking the idea of freedom and saying, well, we don't really have it, but let's sneak it in through the back door by just by talking about it as though it's still a thing?
Yeah, or we could say, maybe we could say that in some way or another, we are by nature being given some kind of will that the leaf does not have, but we but we are still doomed to have this will or to have this. It's more like something we are doomed to have, not something that we are
Yeah.
giving us possibilities.
One
There's also
reason
an
yeah, go ahead.
interesting. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, it's also an interesting difference between Spinoza's understanding of and the Stoicism. And that is that in the Stoicistic way of thinking, there's often been this duality between feelings and rationality, and that we should always try to if we have feelings about anything, then we should try to rationalize them in some way. And of course, we could say that the Spinoza's way of trying to rationalize is to think of human being that we should try to think of ourselves as just a very small part of the universe, and that could actually be something that could comfort us that we are just a small part of something, this large web of existence. But
is that the role of philosophy, to comfort us? Is it a form of therapy? Or is it the sort of, let's find the truth and whatever cold halcyon heights it leads us to, we're going to go there? Or is philosophy a form of therapy that allows us to deal with the world?
In this, of course, Stoicism is they try to create philosophy as something like a therapy. But I'm not sure of Spinoza. But he says something like this. But he also says that if you have feelings that you are not able to handle, there's only one solution to that, and that is to have another feeling instead of. So he would never say that we are able to, to live a life without feelings, just being rational. He would rather say that you should try to bring active feelings into your life that gives you some kind of pleasure, because we are not able to live without feelings. So we should rather try to bring new and better feelings into our life.
Would it be fair to say, though, that Spinoza, like Descartes, is primarily operating on a rational level? He's not a very touchy-feely philosopher, just like Descartes wasn't. They're mostly about, okay, how do we get to the truth through rational means? It's just that Spinoza started with a different premise than Descartes does. Spinoza starts from the premise of monism, and Descartes starts from the premise of dualism, but they're both very driven rationalistically to their conclusions. One thing I love about Spinoza, and particularly lining Spinoza up with Descartes, is that from completely different premises, you can land on a very similar conclusion. And by conclusion, I'm talking about the ethics. I'm talking about how they think you ought to live in the world based upon their premises about how the world is. And I think that's I don't know, that's a really important thing that maybe allows us to angle into the topic of education and what do we teach kids and so forth. What's a good educational curriculum? Because it's the fact that you can have these two very different sets of premises that can nevertheless find some ground of unity at the end is, I think, a hopeful thing for a world which is riven by so many differences and divisions between peoples and cultures and religions and so forth, that in their own way are starting from different premises. But perhaps it's possible to find unity not at the starting point of the premises, but at the end point, in terms of where do those premises lead you to? What do they say about how you ought to live in the world? I think of the example of Einstein famously said that he believed in the God of Spinoza. But there's another connection, because Einstein began with a completely different set of premises, let's say metaphysical premises, about how the world is structured than the earlier generation of scientists, the Newtonians, who thought of the world in, let's say, Cartesian terms. Everything is divided up crisply into space and time, and can be described in those on a Cartesian coordinate system. Whereas Einstein comes along and says, well, actually, space and time kind of meld into each other in a way. It's one fabric that is a very different philosophical premise, just as mathematically rigorously definable. The endpoint is a set of predictions which, in everyday circumstances, is indistinguishable from the Newtonian physics. But the fact that you have nearly indistinguishable predictions based on a completely different set of starting premises is, I think, that's an underrated piece of insight about how the world works, which could be transposed into the human realm. It's an insight about how the physical world works, but if you transpose that insight into the human realm, I think it's a useful sort of insight. It suggests that it's possible for this very diverse world to nevertheless find grounds for unity.
There's also one important premise you were given us, and that is that the way we understand reality is our action is based on this reality orientation that we have. And I think that's extremely important to understand that what kind of reality we gives children in school actually creates their action or their ethics. I think that's also very important to understand in a educational sense. Cameron, what have you got some ideas based on the discussion we have had so far?
I've enjoyed that. As I said, this was sort of a completely new realm for me. I I like the conclusion that uh, that in the most general terms that sort of a pantheistic approach is is perhaps best interpreted as the possibility for universality, that somehow, yes, everything is connected, and there's always a possibility for something universally acceptable to emerge. Otherwise, I think as it was mentioned at the beginning, like, you know, as you Knut mentioned, was, the existence of evil and things like that. I mean, which essentially is the possibility of non-existence of good, becomes a bit problematic, I think, against the pantheistic background, because, like, how can something exist and not exist at the same time? So,
I
but
think if I should try to, I think it's Spinoza, but I'm not sure on this, and Stephen, maybe you could help me. But the way I interpret Spinoza, he would say that from a human point of view, there might be something that we would understand as evil.
mm,
But in a more divine point of view, our small actions on earth is just a very small, and in the large sense doesn't really have that much to say to reality. So it, we even said that it's evil is just some kind of lackings in in the human action, or yeah. Could that be a way of...
That would be consistent with what I understand of Spinoza, that he wouldn't be focusing all that much about good and evil and turning them into these separate independent sorts of forces in the world. And that actually leads, I think, to an interesting problem with Spinoza that maybe we could get into a little bit. As much as I love Spinoza, I recognize a kind of difficulty with uh, with following up on his premises to get to the conclusion, and the difficulty lies in what I feel seems necessary on a broad social level, societal level, what undergirds ethical behavior for most people? It is the idea that you're rewarded for doing right and you're punished for doing wrong. And society has its own rules and laws and jails and punishments and things like that for when you get caught. But one of the great moderating effects of religion in the world is that it sets up a system of rewards and punishments in your own mind. God out there is ever watchful and rewards you eternally for doing the right thing, even when no one is around, and punishes you eternally for even thinking the wrong thing. And many modern atheists, I think of like Chris Hitchens and others, who like do a great job of tearing down that idea of this invisible God, judging you for your very thoughts, and turns it out into something, this horrific thing, that why would anyone believe in such a thing? But thinking objectively, I think about what is it that enables society to function. Part of it is that people are motivated to do the right thing, even when they know they won't get caught doing the wrong thing, because they have this idea of existential rewards and punishments, of eternal rewards and punishments that um, that influences human behavior. So the problem I have with Spinoza is that he is so rationalistic in his approach. And yes, he gets to the same endpoint with his ethics about how we ought to be in the world, in regard to others. But following the rational line, you wonder, well, where's the motive? Where's the sort of rewards and punishments that the theist would have that so clearly defines right and wrong behavior, that maps out what you ought to do in the world, that maps out how you ought to act in, say, pro-social ways? With Spinoza, that motivation, because there is no existential punishment, God is not out there going to punish you if you do the wrong thing. The motive force for your ethical behavior has to entirely come from within. And I wonder if that is always going to be, this is my question, is that always only going to be the province of a minority of human beings, that they're capable of self-motivating in the moral sphere? They're capable of following the austere pathways of Spinoza's philosophy to its endpoint, and out of their intellectual conviction of the rightness of it, do the right thing? Is that always going to be some small minority of humanity, whereas the larger fraction of the human race will need a little bit more tangible rewards and punishments? What do you all think?
I think it's a scary, it's a little bit scary thought, actually, because it also, if this is true, then if you are becoming a leader of a country or something, then you could even bring in noble lies to society, because they the people, they need them just to act normal, or in a good ethical sense. I, I think in my view, I think most people, and this is maybe also because this is what I see in school, is that most kids want to do good, and they if they could behave as they want to, then they mostly want to do good. And they also in a very young at a very young age, they learn, they understand the difference between good and bad. Even though I'm not sure if anyone has told them this or anything, but they are very aware of it, and they are very early into justice. They often have some strange understanding of what justice is, but they have a very strong feeling of justice as the opposite of unjust behavior or unjust actions. So in my view, I think there are other more rationalistic reasons why human actually do things that is unjust, and it's often more. I think our economical rationality is one of the main reason, and I think actually it has something to do with lack of understanding of reality as we have been discussed today. That I think most people they become so narrow, they don't see the to actually to feel the universe, or to feel that you are part of something that is bigger than yourself, and then they end up turning everything into some kind of economical rationality, and then there becomes more interested in their own goods, material goods, than anything else. But I would say that it doesn't. It's not that they need something more. It's more like if you had given them some kind of other perspectives on life, I think everybody is able or could be able to act more in their natural ways as they were children.
So your mention of noble lie makes me think about, I don't know, the two different ways to proceed on this topic. And one would be, well, we reject the idea that we're going to govern society by a noble lie, like as Plato's Republic was undergirded by this noble lie of the bronze and the gold, the silver and the gold, classes that you're born into that are fixed and unchanging. The other way one could go is, so one way to go would be, I reject the noble lie, and we're going to try to build an ethics totally on rationality. We have confidence in humanity. You can all work your way through this reasonably from reasonable premises. The other way to go, and maybe, and this is again a question mark, and maybe it's going to sound a little bit less optimistic about human nature, but the other way to go would be to say, human beings only think that they're reasonable. Usually reason is the handmaid of our biases. Usually reason is used to get to the point that we have already decided based on our biases. And in reality, again, maybe I'm being too pessimistic here. People are much more governed by their feelings and intuitions and things that they may have learned, absorbed from their parents, their culture, and so forth, than from an actual reasoning process of based on rational premises and so forth. If we, for the moment, accept that may be the case, then we're back into this realm of, well, is it a noble lie, for example, to teach children under a more, say, theistic conception of the world, which has the benefit and the advantage of being very clear about what's right and wrong? You may yourself not think that the theistic conception of the world is the ultimate or best explanation. Of course, you don't have evidence one way or another, but your own intuition may be more Spinoza's intuition, that I'm a more monist in my thinking about things, but to a 6-year-old, they're not really going to get monism. They're going to get they're going to get the sort of behavioral incentives that most of humanity throughout its history has, which is that there's rewards and punishments. And I guess my question is it a noble lie to do so when you understand that the metaphysical underpinnings in any case is always just a way of getting to an endpoint, and the endpoint is the real thing? So, I mean, example, is it a noble, okay, maybe I'm stretching the metaphor a little bit. Is it a noble lie when a physicist uses Newton's equations to compute, the trajectory of a rocket, when they well know that Einstein's equations are more correct in all cases? It's just a lot more difficult to work with Einstein's equations. So you work with Newton's equations, and you plug in your masses and your accelerations and your time increments and all, as though they were really separate things. Are you lying to yourself when you do that? In that brief moment of child education when you learn division, but you haven't yet learned fractions, and you learn 4 divided by 2 is equal to 2. Well, what's 4 divided by 3? Oh, you can't divide 4 into 3. In a couple years you learn that yes, that's equal to 4/3, but before you learn the concept of fractions, you're taught that, well, certain things can divide into other things and others can't. So is it is it a lie? Are you lying to the kids at that stage of their education when you tell them something which is not really true? It's not really true, but you also know that as they get older, and as their capacities develop, they're going to be able to understand things with more nuance, and then they're going to understand that you can actually divide 4 divided by 3 in a rational way. Am I like pulling in too many threads here when I suggest that that traditional theism, even if one philosophically thinks is not the best ultimate explanation, may nevertheless be useful, but not useful in the sense that this is some sort of make-believe fairy tale or some sort of noble lie or some sort of convenient illusion or whatnot, but that it represents a metaphysical basis which ends up pointing in the correct direction because it lands on the right place, which is ultimately all of these systems of thought are nothing if they don't translate on the ground into how we live in the world. And if you get to how we live in the world in the right way, in what we think is the right way, then who cares what the metaphysics was behind it?
I think one of the difficulties in just presenting like a traditional theism is that you will always get children that is critical. There are stories and there are lack of rationality in the stories because that we know more today than we did 2000 years ago. And this is sort of the interesting is at the whole beginning of historical critical reading of the Bible is actually Spinoza. He was like the first one who really started this. Mm-hmm. But he would say that okay, there are something in this that is original wrong because it is the attempt they had at that time to give a rational understanding of the metaphysical part of reality. But that doesn't mean that everything is not valid. And so he would make a huge difference between the origin of something and the validity of something. And he would say that still there are a lot of stories in the Bible that is valid as a story and as something to really to understand what human being is, what reality is, and also what a good action is. So he would say that we have to differ between these kind of between the genesa and validity, and that we should be more focusing on, if we are to present a traditional theism in school, then we have to be sure that this could be a valid story in that sense, that is in a metaphysical sense, but also to understand that metaphysical question is part of reality and is part of being human. Mm-hmm. And I think that's in my understanding, and especially in school today, I would say that the biggest problem is that there are no room for metaphysical discussions, and there are no room for metaphysical answers from these old traditions to be given, just to give the young kids the possibility to understand what cultural history we actually come from, and to also to give them the possibilities of having answers and having thoughts that they have not been by themselves able to think or to make opinion about, because they're just one human being. So we have the possibility to bring in the whole tradition, bring in the whole history of different understanding, to give them a bigger reality, to give them a reality that they didn't even know existed.
Mm.
But that is a big problem today, because we are too focusing on what I would say is presentism. That we're too focusing on that each and every one of us should have just their own understanding of all these questions, and this should come from their inner selves, and they should be able to bring this up by themselves. So in my opinion, it's extremely important to bring in traditional theism, but not only as like one answer, but more like what kind of really important metaphysical questions are in reality, and it is part of human existence that we are to bring up and to have the discussions on.
I mean, I have always personally had a difficult time. I mean, since we are, like ethics has been a central issue here. I mean, to me, ethics for any other than very utilitarian purposes is inconceivable if there is no superior existence, being, intelligence, whatever you want to call it, what we normally refer to as God. If there is nothing higher than human intelligence, or um, if there is no real purpose for human existence, that this is just some sort of a strange coincidence that we exist, then I think that, at least to me, ethics makes absolutely no sense, other than in terms, as I said, utilitarian terms. I mean, I would be ethical only to the point where it would secure my own well-being. I mean, I would treat you nicely because I want to make sure that you will at some point treat me nicely back. But in all the circumstances where I could get away with anything, like just doing anything at all, from stealing to I don't know, sexual harassment or whatever, I would do it because, like, so what?
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't have any, scruples for it, because, this is all of this is pointless and meaningless anyway. So it's a bit like in a dream, you often do things you wouldn't do in reality, because, especially if you're aware that this is just a dream. So here you can do anything you want. So I think that, and thus, for instance, what Stephen was referring to in terms of bringing up, issues of punishment and reward, I think that essentially the punishment and rewards that we mete out in this world are really representative of something that in some traditions is referred to as the law of karma. I mean, that actually the way reality is built is that and I think this is not a form of utilitarianism. It's actually a metaphysical principle that when you do certain things, then those are conducive to yours or others' happiness, and to things sort of going a good way. And there are other things that will have other kind of consequences. And I think our systems of reward and punishment are just sort of making it more immediate and more concrete. But I think they have fundamentally a metaphysical basis, because I think that fundamentally, metaphysically, are these do have consequences and lead to different directions.
Maybe there are more than two options. I think we might imagine that there's only really fundamentally two ways to think about this. The first way is materialism. The world just is, and any ethical systems we generate are just purely going to be utilitarian. And the second way is, there is some, let's say, external deity that is dispensing rewards and punishments based on some arbitrary, goal that deity has set for its creation. Spinoza's ethics is, in a way, I think, a refutation of both of those. He's getting to the ethical life through neither of those two pathways, neither the theistic nor the atheistic. And this is where I think he's greatly misunderstood and mistakenly labeled as an atheist, whereas it's true that he's not a theist, but that God intoxicated man nevertheless saw the operations of what he conceived of as the divine within the world as opposed to outside the world. But that links to the problem that I mentioned, that the ethical system that emerges from that is one that has to be motivated not by this idea of rewards and punishments as a result of your actions that come from the outside, but somehow you have to get to the point, if you follow Spinoza, you have to get to the point where the punishment of an evil action is its own action. The action itself is the punishment. And the reward for a good action is the action itself. And I think, and that's where I wonder, is it possible for most of humanity ever to come to that realization? I personally, my own philosophical temperament is really likes that conclusion. That's what I think is it seems to me to be a more nuanced way of thinking about the world. But I wonder whether what is ultimately true necessarily entirely correlates with what humanity needs, what society needs. But now we're back into the whole question of noble lie, and I don't know if I have a good answer for that personally. I mean, these are issues that I've been thinking about and struggling with for many years, and my only conclusion so far is that somehow we have to make space for these different sorts of temperaments, because different people are think differently about this, and the point of unity that we have to find existentially as a human race, I don't think is going to exist in the metaphysical plane, but I think it may potentially exist more in the ethical plane.
Should we now try, because I think we could end up in a circle of of arguments if we. So I just, because we also have, when we have discussed school now, we're mostly on the discussion on what kind of reality we are to, what is reality and what kind of stories and where is history come in this picture. But my in the beginning, I thought that maybe we could try to say something about human skills or human needs, or I think that's an interesting idea, that what kind of abilities do we understand that there should be space for in school? What kind of you said, Stephen, that we should have a space for different temperaments. Yeah, so maybe that could be, temperaments, virtues, different. Cameron, do you have any ideas on
Well,
what kind of
as I said,
skills?
There is an analogy that is offered in the Baha'i writings, which I find very fruitful from a pedagogical point of view. And the analogy is one of considering human beings, every human being, as a mine of precious gems, and that the purpose of education is to bring these gems, these human gems, uh, into, not only to bring them to daylight, but to bring them to serve humanity. Now, if you think of the process of in reality, the process of mining gems, gem mines, and I sometimes have shown my students, pictures. I say, this is my conception of human being is this, and they say, what, a hole in the ground? Like what's the analogy behind this? But because essentially a gem mine doesn't look like anything very, fabulous. It's mainly actually sand and mud, and there in between you have gems. So the first thing about mining gems is that you have to separate the gems from all the other, sort of unuseful stuff that's around them. then you have to cut those gems and you have to polish them, and only then they become actually useful, either for industrial purposes or for decorative purposes, whatever. And I think this analogy sort of goes well with what we know about human beings, that okay, human beings, and on the one hand have those sort of um, very selfish and often destructive drives that we share with animals or other animals, however you want to put it. But then we have something that is gem-like in us all human beings. As you mentioned, the word virtues could be maybe used in connection with that. Qualities such as uh, selfless love, or sense of justice, or uh, patience, or forgiveness, or things like that. And these seem to be available, though maybe to different degrees and a different combination in all human beings. So then one could say that the most important aspect of education is to help students. Well, first, of course, as teachers have to see these qualities in the students, and not be just, because we often see those, that sand and mud, first of all, because there sometimes is a good portion of that. So when we see the misbehavior, or the wrong inclination of the students, we often, most of all, react to that. But to be able to see past that and find those gem-like qualities, however weak, or however hidden among those other things they might be, and to bring them to the attention of the student himself or herself, and help them develop those and polish those, and use them in service to humanity. I think that would, to me, would be like the main point of education. And I think this is something that then brings a great universality also to the effort, because these human gems are in all human beings, regardless of their culture, their background, their race, whatever. And they're what sort of, I think, creates a fundamental link between us, and thus, as Stephen was saying, I think somehow they're also the foundation for the possibility of a universal ethics, because these virtues are recognized, and they're so to say applicable, or every human being has access to them, and every human being can live by them. And so to me, that is one way that we could approach the sort of main purpose of education. I think all the scientific knowledge that we bring then into the picture, and of course that's going to be very important, has then to do with the how of it. I mean, how do we then polish? How do we practice these human qualities, or these human virtues, in a way that would be most beneficial for our collective human development and blossoming?
I think that's a beautiful analogy, and I think extremely consequential for how we think about education. And the consequence of it, I think, is most clear if we contrast it with another way of thinking about the human being, which is like a tabula rasa, or a lump of
Yes.
clay, something which ultimately is you write whatever you want on it. And if that's your view of the human, then you might go a very different direction with how you educate children. In that case, you would, if all children are lumps of clay or blank pages, then it makes sense to put them all in one room and all force the same thing on them that you've decided is the right thing that human beings should be, because you don't have to take into account any sort of intrinsic potentiality or distinction between the children because they're all lumps of clay. But with the mine analogy, if every person is a mine, there's has some unique gem just located in a unique place in the mind that has a different sort of flaws internally that then require different sorts of faceting and polishing and all of that, then you end up with a kind of educational philosophy which is going to be much more tailored individually to what those individual potentialities and needs of students are. Of course, then we run into the practical issue of, one of them sounds a lot more expensive than the other, because one of them requires more resources and a lot more intentionality, a lot more diversification in methods and so forth, which may not be possible pragmatically for a society, or for a particular school at a particular point in time. Might not be able to afford all that kind of individualized instruction that we think is really required by the true nature of the students.
I think there are certain things where there is no shortcut. I mean, we cannot bypass them. And I think that unless the teacher takes the time and makes the effort to get to know each student individually, and to understand what their gems are, and also to understand what are maybe some of the rubble and stone and so forth that hides these gems, then then they're not able to really uh, play out their role as teachers. I don't think there's this. I mean, I think this is the difference between, like, that schools can never be made into factories where you're just trying to bring out efficiency to, maybe you can do that with the tabula rasa idea of filling up as many heads as possible with certain information. But as far as human development is concerned, there needs to be this relationship between the educator and the one being educated, which is based on uh, and I think this is something that Buber tried to bring out, this sort of thou relationship needs to be there. We have to know each other. We have to recognize, and I think that, I mean, I think even in practical terms, the the when time, I know from personal experience, and of course from a lot of research, that when teachers actually do invest that time and energy to create such relationships, then wonderful things can happen, and really there can be such joy when the school becomes this kind of a meeting place of human beings, and a place of human blossoming. And of course, the teacher blossoms together with the student, because that whole process of being, part of that, this finding of gems, it's not only nice for the gems, it's also nice for the person who finds the gems, if you see what I mean. So it's a so I think there is no way around it. And I think also Kierkegaard was a philosopher who tried to say this, that, unless you have, I think the way he wanted to put it is that unless you have this genuine love for your student, you cannot be a real teacher.
I think what you both, like, you have created two analogies here, one with gems and one with clay. And I think that one of the biggest problem in the modern educational system is that our curriculum is based on the idea of the clay, because it's a curriculum where you have already decided what kind of skills. It's not what kind of information or what kind of knowledge the students are to have, but it's what kind of competences. So they have decided what kind of abilities each and every one of us should have when we are ended school. And then school is just becoming the formation of the clay through different activities in the classroom. This is more typical in Europe for the moment. I'm not sure how it is, but it's very what I would call behavioristic way of understanding learning and what human being is. And so I would say that if we have to, if we should bring the gem analogy into life, into the school, and we have to create a different kind of curriculum where we are not focusing on what kind of competence they have to, what kind of outcome the children should have when they end. but we could have like a naturalistic curriculum where we actually writes down what kind of gems we actually sees in our classroom based on what is actually going on there. But of course, so what we also need to have something going on, and that's where I would say that knowledge has to be brought in back into the classroom, because in the Norwegian system, knowledge is not very interested in school anymore. But we could bring in like stories from atheistic tradition, or we could bring in historical knowledge from philosophy or natural science, or all these kind of understanding of what is important to know for a human being. Also wisdom and these kind of ideas. And then, of course, the gems we are looking for is more the abilities and what the children are getting interested into based on the curriculum of knowledge, where we could just bring into life, or to try to, for instance, like the world of mathematics, that there exists like a world of mathematics, and we can try to bring it into the children, and they could feel what kind of interest they get into them.
If I mean, because this is a very big subject, and we might want to continue that, but I think fundamentally and very simply in my mind, the issue here, the fundamental issue here is the issue of the ends or purposes. I mean, why do we end up with certain competencies that we want to teach children? It's because we look at the way society is functioning now, the requirements of working life, of corporate life, whatever, and we see that there are certain practical skills that people have to have so that we can have a prosperous society. So basically, it's the conception of an economically prosperous society that is that sort of drives our educational system. Our educational system is just one means of making sure that our country will be economically prosperous in the global economy. And there are certain skills that people have to have for that to happen. But it would be a different picture in some ways uh, if our if the purpose and the end of education was how can we educate noble human beings.
I think that's an interesting question, and it reminds me of what happened on Iceland 2010 or something. They had big problem, economical problems, and they got bankrupt. I think more or less the whole country. One thing they thought was that they had lack of ethical persons on the power positions in the Icelandic society. So there was a Icelandic philosopher that was brought back. He was living. I think he still lives in England, but he was brought back to bring in ethics into school. But I'm not sure how this ended or how this did it work, because when I read, because I've read some of the curriculum on Iceland, and it's not much difference from the Norwegian one or the Swedish. I agree with you, Cameron, that in our way of writing the curriculum, we have this idea about economic become more rich. But I don't believe that the competences that they are brought into the curriculum is actually the competence we need if to become more rich was our most important ability.
Well, yeah, that's another thing that
Yeah.
that of course, because schools are usually very much behind the rest of society, so some of these skills might be outdated. But but I think that their basic logic is that it's I would again like to go back to Immanuel Kant. I mean, I think it's a question is, are we treating human beings as objects or as subjects? I think in schools we definitely treat human beings as objects. And I
Yeah,
think we should go back to treating them, well, maybe not go back, but I mean, start treating them as subjects.
I agree with you, and I think that's one of one of the biggest problem is that it seems like it is the society that is the reason for a human being to exist, and not vice versa.
Mm.
So, and of course, the school should be for the children, and then we should
Yes.
try to actually to give the children of the next generation a possibility to create their own society based on what they want to. And of course, that would be nice if there would be nobles.
I realize we're at the end, and I'm just going to introduce a massive new subject, which would have to be for the future. But I think we have to mention at some point that our whole paradigm of thinking about education as a teacher with a classroom, our whole idea about what are the things that kids ought to learn and so forth is in the process of massive disruption because of AI and the potential of AI to transform the way we think about how information is delivered to individual students. Personally, I don't think in a way that's ever going to remove the benefit of a classroom, the benefit of a physical teacher, obviously the social benefits of humans interacting and so forth. But I mean, just anecdotally, on my way from dropping my daughter off from school, I had about a half an hour driving home, and so I turned on ChatGPT 4 and I had a great conversation about Spinoza. And and ChatGPT 4 in voice mode has some great information about Spinoza. But I found also it all depended on, did I ask a smart enough question to get a good enough answer? And it wasn't yet to the point of being able to sustain a real conversation and to like toss the ball back to me in a way that moves things in a good direction. But I think the technology will, within a few generations, get to the point where a real sustained conversation with an AI, entity that has enough background knowledge on you, previous conversations, an idea of what your gaps are, what could be filled, or what your strengths are, and so forth, could really change the way, I believe, inevitably is going to change the way we think about education, on the level of information,
Yeah.
on the
Yeah,
level of what we've
absolutely,
mainly been
absolutely.
talking about, moral education, how do you mine the gems and so forth. I don't know. I'm less optimistic in the near term that we're going to see chatbots that do a good job of mining
No,
the
no,
moral
but
gems that lie within us.
I suggest that maybe for our next I just uh, was invited to give a lecture some days ago, an online lecture to university in Finland, and the lecture was titled uh, "Imperatives of Education in the Age of AI and Trump." And I think that those two represent certain, important sort of forces in current world, and our education has to somehow sort of take stock of both of them. And I think if we are to respond to the challenges and possibilities by both of those, then our education needs to be transformed very radically. So if you want, we could maybe look at the implications of a world that
Yeah.
where Trumpianism and AI are important
Uh,
forces.
yeah.
What
Because
are they?
I'm in a way pretty optimistic about the AI. I don't
Yeah,
understand
yeah,
AI
yeah,
because I don't understand AI as artificial intelligence, but artificial information.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, no.
And the lack of intelligence is that's my. I think that the more we get AI into school, the less information will be part
Mhm.
of schooling, and maybe wisdom and virtue
Exactly.
could be
That's yeah. That
become
exactly.
a
That
huge part of
exactly
of
exactly.
schooling. So
Exactly.
I'm a little bit optimistic. I agree. We could try to have that the next time.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I think we'll end there. I hope you have
Thank you very
enjoyed
much.
our long conversation this time. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time around. Bye bye. You have been listening to Athens and Jerusalem, created by Cameron Namdar, Stephen Phelps, and Knut Ove Essay. Nora Juel is the broadcast voice and technical support. Music is pieces of Edvard Grieg's Morning Mood. The voices in the intro are Viktor Frankl, interview with Robert Oppenheimer, and Pope John Paul II. Thank you for listening, and please check out another episode.